Hi everyone, this is Miss Romani, and during this lesson we will explore the digestive system, the body system that lets us obtain nutrients from the food that we eat. And food is essential to life because it provides our bodies with the energy it needs to run our body functions and with the building blocks we need to grow and repair body tissues. So the digestive system consists of all the parts of our body that work together to help us obtain the nutrients from food. And there are two major groups of organs which comprise the human digestive system. There is the alimentary canal, which is essentially a hollow tube through which food actually passes. This hollow tube is approximately 9 meters long and starts at the mouth or oral cavity, where food goes in, and ends with the anus, where, poop comes out. In between, food passes through the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. There are also accessory organs. These are glands or organs that secrete substances that help the digestion of food, but do not actually hold or transfer the food. These are the salivary glands, the liver and gallbladder, and the pancreas. All these organs and glands work together to break down all the different nutrients in food that are polymers, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats, into their most basic monomers, so that we can then absorb them into our bloodstream and transport them to our body cells, where they are used for energy and as building blocks of molecules and cells. The digestive system also absorbs other nutrients that are in our food, like vitamins, minerals, and water, of course. So the function of the digestive system can be divided into 4 tasks. First, there is the ingestion of food, the process by which food is introduced into the body. In other words, eating. Then there's the very important task of digestion, and this involves the breakdown of these large nutrient molecules in our food into their smallest monomers. Those nutrients would be useless, however, unless we actually bring them into our body, so absorption of those nutrients is essential. And last, there is the elimination of any food that cannot be digested. As far as digestion goes, there are 2 methods our digestive system uses to break down foods. There is mechanical digestion, which involves the physical breakdown of foods into smaller pieces, often by movements like chewing or churning. And then there's chemical digestion, which uses enzymes to break down food chemically by breaking the bonds in the food molecules through hydrolysis reactions. And that chemical breakdown by enzymes of the macronutrients, which are mostly polymers, into their monomers, is key to the digestion of our food. Our cells will only absorb food molecules that are in their basic monomer form, and our circulatory system will only absorb the nutrients from food in those basic monomer forms also. So any food polymers that are not broken down into their monomers by enzymes are simply not absorbed into our bloodstream and do not make their way into our cells. And as we learned in our lesson on enzymes are very specific to the chemical reactions they catalyze. So each different nutrient has a series of enzymes responsible for catalyzing their hydrolysis reaction, their breakdown. Not only that, but enzymes are not secreted all at once, everywhere throughout the alimentary canal. They are secreted at different points. For example, at the mouth, salivary amylase, an enzyme responsible for breaking down starches into molecules of maltose, is released. But at the stomach, the enzyme pepsin, one of the enzymes responsible for the breakdown of proteins, is released. Most enzymes, however, are secreted in the small intestine, both the first section of it called the duodenum and the rest of it. Other digestive juices like hydrochloric acid, which is secreted at the stomach, or bile, which is secreted into the duodenum, help with the breakdown of food by enzymes, by activating some enzymes or by breaking apart the food so that more surface area of the food is exposed to the enzymes. So let's begin our journey through the digestive system step by step. And let's start at the very beginning, at the mouth or oral cavity, where food is ingested. After ingestion, mechanical digestion begins in the mouth as the food is chewed. This is a process called mastication. Food is initially broken down in the mouth by the grinding action of teeth. But the teeth alone cannot chew our food. The tongue also plays a very important role. We use our tongue muscles to position the food so that our jaw muscles can best use our teeth to chew the food. The process of chewing grinds down the food, which increases the surface area of foods and allows a more efficient breakdown by enzymes. Chewing also mixes food with saliva. After chewing, the food that is mixed with saliva is called a bolus, and it is this bolus that is swallowed into our esophagus. Now, saliva is a watery substance that starts the chemical digestion of carbohydrates called starches. Saliva is produced and secreted by the salivary glands, pairs of glands that are found on the side of each cheek and on the bottom of the mouth and under the jaw. They secrete about 1 to 2 liters of saliva into our mouth every day. And saliva is about 98% water, which moistens the inside of our mouth to help with speech and to change food into a semi-liquid mass that can be tasted and swallowed more easily. But saliva is not just water. It also contains other stuff. To start, saliva contains salivary amylase, an enzyme that chemically breaks down the starches into molecules of maltose. Starch is a polysaccharide made up of hundreds of glucose molecules bonded together, and maltose is a disaccharide made up of 2 glucose molecules bonded together. So the amylase in saliva starts the chemical digestion of sugars. But it just starts the process though. Food does not spend enough time in our mouth for all the starch to be fully digested. The digestion of starch starts at the mouth, but is actually completed at the small intestine. Now, saliva plays other roles. Besides starting the digestion of starch, it also contains mucus, a slippery substance that lubricates the food in our mouth. The mucus in saliva also helps bind the masticated food into a slippery bolus that is easier to swallow. And saliva helps maintain the pH of our mouth. Saliva contains ions that act as buffers, keeping the acidity of the mouth within a certain less acidic range. And this prevents minerals in our tooth enamel from dissolving, which helps prevent tooth decay. Saliva also contains antimicrobial chemicals and enzymes that help kill bacteria and other pathogens that enter our mouth. So now that your teeth, tongue, and saliva have formed a bolus of food, you're ready to swallow. The tongue pushes the food towards the back of the throat, where it travels down the esophagus as a bolus. But this is not as easy as it sounds. You see, when you swallow, you move food from the mouth into your throat, a structure also called the pharynx. And branching off of the pharynx is the esophagus, which carries food to your stomach. But also branching off the pharynx is the trachea, or windpipe, which carries air into the lungs. So then, how do we prevent food from moving down our trachea and choking us? The answer is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a leaf-shaped flap of cartilage located behind the tongue at the top of our trachea. The main function of the epiglottis is to prevent the bolus from entering the trachea when we swallow our food. So it basically directs food to travel down the esophagus by blocking the entrance to the trachea, preventing us from choking every single time we swallow food. Now, once the bolus of food has been swallowed, it moves down into the esophagus. Now, the esophagus is a hollow muscular tube that moves food from the pharynx to the stomach. And this movement is not a passive one. Food doesn't simply fall down into our stomach. It is actually squeezed through the esophagus by muscle contractions. The smooth muscle that makes up the walls of our esophagus contracts and relaxes around the bolus of food. This rhythmic muscle movement is called peristalsis. Peristalsis is the reason why you can swallow food when you are lying down, or actually even when you're upside down, and the food will still make it into your stomach. It is also the reason why astronauts can eat in space without the assistance of gravity. We have now arrived at the stomach, where the bolus of food encounters the cardiac sphincter, also called the lower esophageal sphincter. Sphincters are special circular muscles that open and close certain body parts. The lower cardiac sphincter is located at the bottom of the esophagus, where it meets up with the stomach. Its main function is to prevent food and stomach acid from washing back up into the esophagus, but it also allows food to pass from the esophagus into the stomach and allows air to escape from the stomach when we burp. When stomach acid escapes through the cardiac sphincter, we get heartburn, which is an irritation of the esophagus caused by stomach acid. So food has now entered the stomach, a muscular J-shaped sac where the chemical digestion of food really gets going. Inside the stomach, there is a lining of epithelial tissue, which is made up of cells that secrete gastric juices. The entry into these gastric glands are called gastric pits, and they kind of dot the surface of the epithelium, sort of like a well-used pincushion with lots of little dots throughout the inner surface of the stomach. The gastric glands secrete a complex digestive fluid called gastric juice, and different cells of the gastric pits produce different components of the gastric juices. Hydrochloric acid, a strong acid with a pH of only 2, is secreted by cells called parietal cells. The acidic environment created by the hydrochloric acid serves several functions. For example, it helps break apart the cells in the food that we eat and denature the protein in our food, making them more available for chemical digestion by enzymes. It also helps our immune system by killing most of the bacteria that we ingest with our food. Hydrochloric acid is also responsible for creating the highly acidic environment that is needed to activate a protein digesting enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin is also produced by the gastric glands, but by a different set of cells called chief cells. Pepsin is an enzyme that chemically breaks down large proteins into smaller polypeptides. There are also endocrine glands in the stomach that produce hormones like gastrin and ghrelin that stimulate the release of gastric juices, that stimulate muscle contractions by the stomach, or that regulate hunger in response to food. So the chemical digestion of protein starts at the stomach with the enzyme called pepsin, which is helped along by the highly acidic hydrochloric acid, which both denatures proteins and activates the pepsin. But it's not just our food that contains protein. Our stomach is also made of protein. Gastric enzymes that can digest proteins and the hydrochloric acid that can denature them could also do that to the stomach itself. So what stops the stomach from digesting itself? Well, the answer is mucus. The stomach wall is covered by a thick coating of bicarbonate-rich mucus. This mucus forms a thick physical barrier that coats the inner walls of the stomach. And the fact that it has bicarbonate ions also helps neutralize the acidity of the stomach contents before it can damage the stomach lining. Now, despite its protective covering, the inside of the stomach is still a harsh environment. And in fact, the surface epithelium of the stomach lining is completely replaced every 3 to 6 days because of this. The cells lining the stomach just simply don't survive much longer than that. So as effective as the mucosal barrier is, it is not a fail-safe mechanism. Sometimes gastric juices do eat away at the superficial lining of the stomach, creating sores that mostly heal on their own. But deeper and larger sores can form, and when they do, they're called ulcers. The majority of ulcers are caused by infection from a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, or by the excessive intake of some medications, like, say, some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, like aspirin, say. So besides the chemical digestion of proteins, the stomach also serves other functions. And one of those is to store our food. Did you know that the empty stomach is only about the size of your fist? Now, of course, most of us eat a lot more in a single meal than the amount of food that can fit in our fist. Now, that can happen because the inner wall of the stomach is made up of thick folds called rugae that allow the stomach to stretch as it is filled with food. The stomach can actually stretch to hold as much as 4 liters of food and fluid, and then return to its resting size when empty. Now, within a few moments after food enters your stomach, the three layers of muscle that makes up the stomach wall start to relax and contract in a unique type of peristalsis that mixes the bolus of food in your stomach with gastric juices to create chyme. Chyme is basically the name given to food that has been mixed with gastric juice. And chyme will typically remain in our stomach somewhere between 4 to 6 hours before it is slowly released into the small intestine. Now, because our stomach holds our food when we eat, a lot of people think of the stomach as the place where all digestion takes place. But this is not true at all. Most of the digestion actually happens in the next section of the alimentary canal, the small intestine. But the stomach does help to hold food until the small intestine is ready for it. We can eat a lot more in one serving than our small intestine can handle all at once. So the stomach basically holds food and delivers it in small amounts to the small intestine. This movement is regulated by the pyloric sphincter, a sphincter of muscle located in between the stomach and the small intestine that closes and opens to let chyme out of the stomach. So now that chyme has entered the small intestine, let's take a closer look at what happens to it there. The small intestine is the major organ of the digestive system. This is where most food is both digested and where most nutrients are absorbed. Despite being called small, the small intestine actually takes up a lot of space within the abdominal cavity. Now, the size of the small intestine will vary depending on the individual. But on average, the small intestine of an adult human, when stretched out, will measure about 6 meters long, whereas the large intestine in comparison will measure about 1.5 meters. Still quite long, but about 4 times shorter than the small intestine. So this long hollow tube is made up of layers of soft muscle that contract and relax in peristaltic waves. The coiled tube of the small intestine is subdivided into 3 regions. These are called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The shortest region is the duodenum, which begins at the pyloric sphincter, then makes kind of a C-shaped curve around the head of the pancreas. The duodenum receives digestive juices from the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and it is where most of the digestion of nutrients will happen. The primary function of the next section, called the jejunum, is to absorb sugars, amino acids, and fatty acids. The ileum absorbs any remaining nutrients that did not get absorbed by the jejunum, and particularly it absorbs some vitamins and minerals, as well as bile salts that will go on to be recycled. Massive amounts of water are also absorbed by the small intestine. At the duodenum, acidic chyme from the stomach mixes with digestive juices from accessory glands. The chemical digestion of food in the small intestine relies on secretions from the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. The pancreas produces pancreatic juice, which contains digestive enzymes and bicarbonate ions. The liver produces bile, and the gallbladder primarily stores concentrates and releases that bile. So let's focus on the pancreas. The pancreas produces over 1 liter of pancreatic juice every day. It produces mostly digestive enzymes, which can be proteases, which are protein digesting enzymes in their inactive forms. These enzymes are activated in the duodenum. Actually, if they were produced in their active form, proteases would start to digest the pancreas itself, which is actually what happens in a particular disease called pancreatitis. The pancreas also produces enzymes that digest fats, which are called lipases, enzymes that digest starch, amylase, and enzymes that digest nucleic acids like DNA, which are called nucleases. Now, pancreatic juice also contains sodium bicarbonate, like basically baking soda. The sodium bicarbonate that is released by the pancreas is actually very important because it is there to neutralize the acidic chyme that has entered the small intestine. Now, the liver, on the other hand, does not produce enzymes or bases. Instead, it produces bile. Bile acts like a detergent to break up fats and other lipids. Remember that fats are hydrophobic. That is, they do not dissolve in water. So before they can be digested in the watery environment of the small intestine, large pieces of fat in our food, called fat globules, must be broken down into smaller fat globules. This process by which a big fat globule is broken down into smaller pieces is called emulsification. So bile does this because bile contains bile salts. And bile salts have a nonpolar or hydrophobic region and also a polar and hydrophilic region. The hydrophobic region of the bile salts interacts with the fat, whereas the hydrophilic region interacts with the watery chyme in the intestine. So this results in the large fat globules being pulled apart into many tiny lipid droplets. This is kind of the same way that dish soap works on the fats that are mixed with water when you're trying to wash dishes. So by breaking up the fats like this, bile increases the surface area available for the lipid digesting enzymes to do their work. And so this way, lipid digesting enzymes called lipases can start breaking down fats into glycerol and fatty acids. Now, the gallbladder is a muscular sac that is located behind the liver that does not produce anything. It simply stores concentrates and secretes the bile into the duodenum when it is needed by the small intestine. So whenever we need help digesting fats, the gallbladder will release this concentrated bile right into the duodenum. Now here's something interesting about bile. Did you ever wonder why poop is brown and also why our pee is yellow? The color of our feces and our urine is a result of the breakdown of bile. Now, bile sort of has a yellowish green color to start with because it contains a pigment called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a waste product produced when the spleen removes old or damaged red blood cells from our circulatory system. The waste product of the breakdown of red blood cells include proteins, iron, and a toxic compound called bilirubin. In the liver, the proteins and the iron are recycled, but the green bilirubin is excreted into the bile. Now, bilirubin is eventually transformed by intestinal bacteria into stercobilinogen, a brown pigment that gives our poop its brown color. Another byproduct of the breakdown of bilirubin is urobilinogen, which gets absorbed into our bloodstream and gets filtered out by the kidney so it becomes part of our urine, and in turn turns our urine yellow. So at this point, chyme has moved through the duodenum and into the jejunum. But as important as the digestion of food into smaller molecules is the absorption of those molecules into our bloodstream, something that happens as food travels through the small intestine from the duodenum into the jejunum and the ileum. The inner wall of the small intestine has many folds to increase the surface area available for nutrient absorption. The surface of these folds is covered by tiny finger-like projections called villi, and the nutrient absorption is happening at the villi, which have access to blood vessels within them. And these villi increase the surface area available for nutrient absorption tremendously. Each villi is about 1 millimeter long and is also covered in millions of microscopic projections called microvilli. So between the folds, the villi, and the microvilli, the surface area of the epithelial cells that are lining the interior of the small intestine is large enough that if we were to stretch it out, it would cover the surface of a tennis court. And the reason, of course, for this large surface area is so we can maximize the absorption of nutrients by the small intestine. And the absorption of nutrients is happening mostly at the villi. So there are capillaries within each villi that are there to absorb sugars and amino acids. But there are also vessels from the lymphatic system called lacteals, which are there to absorb fats. The nutrients are absorbed through the cells covering the villi, which is where microvilli come in, because microvilli are these projections on the surface of the cells of each villi, which in turn increase the surface area through which nutrients can be absorbed. And it's not just nutrients that are being absorbed through both the villi and microvilli. water absorption is also happening at the small intestine. But even though we've absorbed nutrients and water, we are actually not done yet. There's still the large intestine, which is also called the colon. The main function of the large intestine is the reabsorption of water. Each day, about 9 liters of water enter the alimentary canal as digestive juices. About 90% of this water is reabsorbed back into the body. Most of it at the small intestine, actually, but the rest at the large intestine. When the small and large intestine fail to reabsorb enough water, we can end up with a condition called diarrhea. On the other hand, too much water reabsorption can result in something called constipation. And although technically nutrients are absorbed at the small intestine, not the large intestine, there is one exception, and that is the absorption of nutrients that are produced by bacteria that live in our colon. These bacteria are collectively known as our gut microbiome, and there are over 700 species of them. The role that our microbiome bacteria play in our health is not yet fully understood. It is believed that they play a role in our immune system, but they may also contribute to many other aspects of our health. As a matter of fact, an imbalance of unhealthy and healthy microbes within our gut may contribute to weight gain, to high blood sugar, to high cholesterol, and to a whole bunch of other disorders. This is an area of medicine that is still under study. Gut bacteria also help produce vitamins, including some B vitamins and vitamin K. And they also digest some sugars that are not digested by our own enzymes. The bacteria in our gut is also part of the reason why we fart. When bacteria in our colon break down food, they generate gases. When bacteria in your gut produce methane gas, they make our farts flammable. When they produce sulfur-containing chemicals like, say, hydrogen sulfide, they make our farts stinky. When chyme enters the large intestine from the small intestine, it enters on the lower right side through a section of the large intestine called the ascending colon. Waves of peristalsis moves the chyme through the transverse colon, then the descending colon. And in the process, water is reabsorbed, leading to the formation of feces. And so the final section of the large intestine is called the rectum. And feces are stored in the rectum for a period of time and then are eliminated from the body through the anus. And that concludes our journey through the digestive system. Talk to you soon.